Hello, and welcome back to Hilltop Stovetop, the show where we teach you how to make great food in an ordinary kitchen. Today we are making pumpkin pie, plus making the crust for that pumpkin pie. Now you may notice that there's some slight differences in today's recording process, and given that this is 2020, as we all know, we have to be flexible with what we're doing. Now in our particular area there has been a little uptick in cases, so my cameraman and I have decided to err on the side of caution, and we're keeping some physical distancing, which means that he's not here to be moving the camera around, and it might not look quite as professional as it has in previous recordings. But regardless, he is still going to edit it and make this look great, and the most important thing is that the food is still going to turn out. And that's especially important when we're all stuck at home and we want to make sure that we've got good quality, nutritious meals that are kind of fun for everybody to help out. Now today's show, because we're making the pie crust, some people might think that that's a little intimidating. It's not so bad. It's 4 simple ingredients, and it's all about the technique. If you're at all unsure about this, it's quite all right to go to the store and go to the freezer section and buy a pie crust, but make sure that you're getting a pastry pie crust. This isn't the kind of pie that will work with graham cracker crust or something like that, or even a puff pastry crust. The other thing we're going to do today is we're going to make enough for 2. So this particular recipe makes enough for 2 single crust pies, or a double crust pie if you were making an apple pie or a meat pie or something where you want a top layer to it. But one of the things I find about making pies, there's no point in making just one. I always make 2, and that way I can share it with my friends and neighbors, and that's a great thing. Now, pumpkin pie itself doesn't freeze particularly well. If you were making fruit pies or meat pies, of course they freeze well. You can make them up ahead of time and either bake them and then just warm them up afterwards, or freeze them even before you bake them and then just pop them in the oven when the time comes. This particular pie, because it's a custard pie, doesn't freeze particularly well, so you do have to make it the day before or the day of when you're going to eat it. Custard pies themselves are fairly plain, and all you're doing with the pumpkin pie is adding that little bit of spice and a little bit of pumpkin flavoring. It doesn't take very much pumpkin in total to make it. The other thing with this pie is we can be a little bit sneaky. So today I have pumpkin, but I also have carrot. So we're going to do that as well, so you can see that they come out virtually the same, other than the carrot pie. You have to put a little less sugar in it because the carrots are sweeter. And if you don't have carrots or pumpkin, then you could use sweet potatoes. It's kind of like any orange kind of vegetable will work in this particular case. You could even make it with just plain squash, but it's all about the spices and the custard that makes this pie great. The particular recipe that I'm using comes from the Laura Secord Canadian Cookbook, and they note in their description how different regions have different ingredients. Some places they want to put molasses in it, some places they'll want to put maple syrup in it. I'm sticking with the plain brown sugar because that's the kind of thing that most cooks, particularly novice cooks, they'll at least have brown sugar. You could also make this with white sugar if you like, but I think that the brown sugar adds just a little depth to the flavor. Once again, because we are only dealing with one camera here, I'm going to use a little different format. I'm going to start by going over all of our ingredients, and then I can move to an overhead shot where you can see the technique. So first off is the pie crust itself. The most important thing with the pie crust is the technique that you use. Everybody seems to have their favorite recipe for this. My sister makes hers with shortening, and if I try that, it doesn't work at all. I'm one of these people that prefers to use pure lard. But if you want shortening so that you have a vegetable product versus a meat-based product, then you can choose a recipe that will use shortening. I also use all-purpose flour. For those of my subscribers who live in countries where the usual flour is self-rising flour, you do have to switch to a pastry flour that doesn't have a leavening agent. But personally, I just use all-purpose flour for everything. It is a slightly different amount, and I will be putting the recipe in the description, so the two options are noted there. You put a little bit of salt in it, and most recipes call for just straight water. So what you're doing is you're incorporating the fat and the flour together, adding just enough water to bind it together so you can roll it out. And then when you bake it, as the water evaporates, the fat and the flour make layers. But to make that work even better, what I do is I put a little bit of water, and most of my moisture comes from white rum. Now, we're not going to use anywhere near this whole bottle, don't worry. But what happens is the rum evaporates so quickly, and it gives you an even flakier crust than just plain water will. So that's the ingredients for the pie crust. For the filling itself, of course, we've got pumpkin, and you can buy a pumpkin, like say maybe if it's after Halloween and you want to make that into a pie. You can do that if you go to all the trouble to clean it and cook it and puree it and that sort of stuff. But it's not difficult to go out and buy this can of pumpkin. The main thing is make sure that you get the one that says pure pumpkin. Right next to this on the shelf there will be pumpkin pie filling, and it's in the baking section usually. But if you buy the pumpkin pie filling, that already has spices and all of these other ingredients added to it, so you can't adjust it to your own tastes. So make sure you're getting the plain pumpkin. If you don't have this, like I say, I'm going to make some of this with carrot. And this, I just took regular carrots, peeled them, shredded them, boiled them until they were soft, and then I pureed them in my food processor. So I end up with something that's the same consistency as the pumpkin. It's just a little brighter color. We are also going to add milk and eggs, and we have brown sugar. You can use white sugar if you prefer. We've got cinnamon, we have nutmeg. The nutmeg's over here, and the nutmeg I prefer to use is the stuff that comes in the little the whole pod, and we're going to use a little grater to grate that so it's fresh and very flavorful that way, and then also ground cloves, and that's about all there is to it. And then the last thing I have over here is of course the whipped cream, which we're going to need to top it off, but only after it's cooled properly. So there's all of our ingredients set to go. I'm going to move the camera over and wash my hands. Don't forget to wash the hands because you are going to get into the nitty-gritty here fairly shortly. And we'll carry on from here. All right, so now we have our hands all properly washed. In this bowl here I have 1 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour. If we were using pastry flour, I'd have 2 cups of it, but this is enough for the all-purpose flour. After we've got our flour all ready, the next thing is the lard or shortening if that's what you're using. Now anytime you're dealing with solid fats like lard, shortening, or butter that come in a rectangle like this, each one of these packages is exactly 1 pound, which equates to 2 cups of solid fat. So rather than dirtying a measuring cup, all we have to do is mark it, but the halfway part, so that's 1 cup. Now for this particular recipe, we need 2/3 of a cup, so if we kind of divide this into thirds, there we've got our 2/3 of a cup, and we just cut straight down. And if you're not sure of your eyeball on this, even on the side of the package, they usually have some kind of a measuring marker. So there you can see we've got from here to here 2/3 of a cup. That doesn't get much easier than that. So we're going to take that off and plop it right into our butter. Move this off to the side. Bring this over here. Now, some people prefer to use, there's all kinds of systems. Some people say use 2 knives. I remember in home ec class they made us use those funny pastry cutters, which are sort of a U-shaped thing with about 5 blades in them. I find that just is one more thing that you need to wash afterwards, and I always end up having to do this anyway. So the reason I was so adamant about we wash our hands is once we have this into kind of bigger chunks, then we're going to get in with our hands. And what I do is I just squeeze it. So I've got a bit of flour and a bit of lard, and I just squeeze it between my fingers so that the lard and the flour is being well mixed. And every time I'm squeezing it, the lard gets into smaller and smaller pieces. So you'll see that they say in the instructions to get it so that it's like small peas or like cornmeal. One way or another, you want to have that fat evenly distributed. You don't want any chunks of fat in it, because that's just going to end up with a grease spot on your pastry. You want to have it evenly distributed through the flour. And once I've got it into smaller pieces, then I pick up bunches of it and just rub back and forth, and that process of rubbing it back and forth incorporates the flour and the fat together. So you can see there's still little bits of fat, so we're just going to keep going until it's evenly mixed, and it will feel like the flour is moist, not moist enough to hold together to roll it out, but it's definitely getting a more homogeneous feel to it. And so now when we get clumps, it's clumps of fat and flour together. It's not just straight fat anymore. So you want to make sure that you've got all of the flour out of the bottom, because that sometimes it's easy to miss little bits. And I think that's pretty good. So now I just take the knife and scrape, because you always end up with some stuck to your fingers, and it's a bit of a nuisance to wash off. And this is just a regular table knife. It's not anything sharp. It's just scraping all the bits off my fingers. And then we're going to wash up again, because otherwise we're going to get grease all over everything. Okay, so now the next thing we need is 1/4 cup of liquid. And if you're using straight water, you want to make sure that it is cold water. It's, like even ice water, if that's something that you've got available. And because you don't want the water melting out any of the fat before it goes into the oven. So I just put a little splash of water. 1/4 cup is 4 tablespoons. And so I'm probably putting a tablespoon of water to 3 tablespoons of white rum. And this isn't like the wine. We don't have to taste test. You can if you want, but you don't have to. So I've ended up with 1/4 cup of liquid there. And the recipe actually says 4 to 5 tablespoons. And some recipes will say add it until it's moist. I've done this pastry enough times that I know that 1/4 cup, assuming that I'm using the right proportions of fat and flour, is going to work perfectly. Now, when I said the technique was key with pastry, this is part of it, and that is the less you have to handle it, the better. If you're making bread, you want to knead it a whole lot. With pastry and with baking powder biscuits, things like that, the less you handle it, the better. So we want to move this in quick and get it mixed up. So we just dump the whole works in there. Oh, I forgot the salt, sorry. Put a little squirt of salt. And we're just going to give this a quick mix around with a fork. And I'm just doing just enough to start incorporating that water. If I'd mixed it with my hands at this point, it would have all just stuck to my hands. But there we've got a mixture in there. Now I'm going to go back to my hands and just squeeze it all together and move it around just enough to get the loose bits off of the bottom. And if I don't get every last bit, I'm not going to worry about it, but it's worked out quite well today. And that's as much as I'm going to work this dough. And if you split it in two, each one of these is enough for one crust of the pie. So we're just going to set this off to the side because we need room to roll this out. Get this out of the way. And I have a little thing here. It's called a pastry cloth. My grandmother used to have one of these. It's a special cloth, which it's kind of like a canvas type material. It's very heavyweight. And what this does is it gives you a smooth surface so that you don't get your counter all stuck with stuff. If you don't have one of these, you could use wax paper or parchment paper. And that way when you're done rolling, you can just pick the whole thing up and shake the excess into the garbage, and it's much easier cleanup. So, but I still, even though I've got a cloth, I'm still adding a little bit of flour to that. And I also have my rolling pin here, and I've got a non-stick silicone coating on my rolling pin. And I have my rolling pin, I don't know if you can see it here, but it's actually made out of marble. And it's a really heavy weight to it. And I like this, and I do make a fair bit of pastry, so this is a good thing for me. If you've just got a plain wooden one, that's fine. When I was a kid growing up, my mom had one that was glass, and you would fill it with ice water to add the weight and keep things chilled. If you don't have anything else, take a pop bottle that has a smooth surface, put some water in it for weight, and that works as well too. So we take our half of our dough, squish it down, kind of move it into a circular shape, flip it over so there's flour on both sides, and roll it out once, and roll it out again, and just spread it out so that we're big enough to fit our pie plate. And there we go. Just happen to have a pie plate handy. And I'm going to move that off to the side though. And first we're going to take this, flip it over in half. You can flip it over in quarters. If your pastry is too dry, it would crack if you tried to do that. So we've got a nice moist pie crust. Now these particular pie plates that I had, these are just ones that came from, I think I got them at the dollar store. You don't have to go with expensive ones. And sometimes it's great to have just disposable ones. And that way, if you're taking a pie over to the neighbor, you don't have to worry about getting one back. Now, the next part here, if you were making something like a lemon meringue pie where you were baking the crust separately, you would poke a bunch of holes in this because as it starts to bake, it's going to puff up and could potentially get bubbles in it. In this case, we're going to have filling in there, so we don't have to worry about that. But we do want to make a little bit of a prettier edge. So I just pinch it. Some people are very artistic with this. And as I'm pinching, I'm breaking off the excess amounts on the sides. There we go, one pie crust done. And then we'll do the second one, basically the same thing. Then we can pick up the scraps. Now what you can do with the scraps is when we're finished all of this, you can take this and roll it out, sprinkle a little cinnamon and sugar on it, and just bake that for 5 or 10 minutes. It will You have to watch it carefully because it will burn quite quickly, but it's kind of like a mini cookie, and it's always kind of a fun thing when you make your own pie crust to have those little extra bits. And if you do have excess pastry that sticks to your rolling pin, just make sure you clear it off, otherwise you're going to get lumps and bumps in the next one that you roll out. You don't have enough flour on it so it doesn't stick, but you don't want so much that you're making it harder and drier. And you see how that it's stuck and it ripped, but that's okay because it's very forgiving. You just pull it off, maybe put a little more sugar so it doesn't, or sugar, it's flour so it doesn't stick a second time. Also notice that the pies that I'm making here are they're kind of a deeper dish to them. If I was using a smaller disposable pie plate, I might even actually end up with 3 pies out of this, just because this has got a good inch of depth to hold lots of filling. And if you don't want crust at all, you can actually take this filling and put it in some kind of heat-proof bowl that's been properly greased so the stuff doesn't stick to it, and put that bowl in a pan of water and bake it like that, and then you get a pumpkin pudding, which tastes just fabulous too. Okay, so there we go. We've got 2 crusts ready to go, and just a little bit of pieces left over, which I'm just going to set off to the side for now. And then all we have to do is fold up our little cloth, and that will go in the wash with my dish towels. So now we're ready for the filling, and just 2 eggs into the bowl here. And 1 cup of milk. We want 1.5 cups of the pumpkin. Now I'm just going to put this side by side so you can see that the pumpkin and the carrots are a much brighter color, but they're pretty darn close and they're pretty good consistency compared to each other. But we'll start this off with the pumpkin. I will do the carrot ones separately, and when you see the finished product, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But it's the same technique. Doesn't matter which you're using. Yeah, that's about 1.5 cups. And a little bit of salt, of course. There's something about salt that it doesn't take very much, but it does pull a lot of flavors out of things very nicely. So we're going to take that, and I'm actually, for this part of it, I'm going to use a whisk. And because, make sure we've got, this is a little bit better technique. Goodbye there. Now, the next thing we're going to do is put in the brown sugar. Now, the recipe actually calls for 1.5 cups of brown sugar. Personally, I don't like mine that sweet. I want to be able to taste the pumpkin a little bit more, so I'm just putting in 1 cup of brown sugar. And when you're measuring brown sugar, it should come out like that, following the shape of the cup. And we want to put in a teaspoon of cinnamon, which is right over here. There's in the, teaspoon of sugar. And we want a half a teaspoon of ginger, which I forgot to mention. And the one thing with ginger is it's okay to, or actually for this, you want to use powdered ginger. A little bit much there. So half a teaspoon of ginger. And we want a half a teaspoon of nutmeg. And again, we're using this little grater bit. And you can tell, just like we're going to pare it back to about there, and that'll be your half a teaspoon on there. And I could grate it onto a board and then measure it all out. But I can tell by just putting my fingers at a spot that would be about that half teaspoon mark, that when I grate down to where my fingers are, that we're done. This is one of these times when you say to yourself, man, I'm glad I don't have really long fingernails. It would make it tough to be a baker. And then the last thing we're going to put in is the allspice. Oh, I know I've got it here. So there we go. No, sir, it's not allspice. It's cloves that we're putting in here. And this is just a little bit, just a quarter of a teaspoon. And I'm being not exactly 100% accurate with my measuring, but I've been doing this for a few years. I mean, if you're not sure, by all means, get out your measuring spoons. And that's it. Now this is enough for one of these pies. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to fill up the one pie, and then you don't need to watch me do it because it's the same technique, but I'm going to make a second one that's the carrot pie, and then we'll put them in the oven at the same time. And speaking of which, we should have our oven preset for 450 degrees. And there we go. So we got our pie crust ready to go. We're going to pour this in. And what you're going to do here, you'll notice that there is a little bit of space between the top of the pie and the top of the filling, right in here. And that's a good thing. And that's where I was talking about having a deeper dish pie crust. And you can buy disposable pans that are specifically deep dish pie crusts as well. Because this is actually going to rise up just a little bit. The eggs in it will make it rise just a little bit. So if you were filling that right to the top, I mean, sometimes that's going to happen, but if it does, put something underneath it, like some aluminum foil or something on the rack underneath your pie, because otherwise you're going to end up with it bubbling all over the place. The other thing that we're going to do, because we start this off at 450 degrees, which is the part where your moisture in the pie crust evaporates to make that flaky crust. But it also has the potential to make the crust kind of brown by the time we're finished this whole almost an hour long baking process. So I have these nifty little things that I cover up the edge of my pie with. Now, if you don't have one of these, that's okay. Don't rush out to buy one. This was a brilliant gift that somebody gave me. But if you don't have one of these, just take a sheet of aluminum foil and fold it into a collar about an inch and a half, 2 inches wide, and form it around the outside of the pie plate like that. And when we're finished, when we get close to the end of the baking, I'll take this off for the last 10 minutes to let it brown at that point, but we don't want the stuff to burn. Okay, so there's our first pie ready to go into the oven. Great. So this is our second pie that we're doing, and I'm just using the same bowl because it's all the same ingredients exactly. And so we've got our 2 eggs, a cup of milk, cup and a half of carrot, and a little bit of salt there. And then we want a half teaspoon of ginger. Okay, so now we got our 2 pies side by side, and I know which one is the pumpkin one and which one is the carrot one, but a lot of people wouldn't be able to guess, and it might surprise guests if you told them one was carrot and one was pumpkin, and try to discern the difference. So I've got my oven now at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a very hot oven to start with. And so I'm not going to reach in any more than necessary. I'm just going to pop these pies straight in. And then we're going to cook them at that temperature for 10 minutes. And then we'll see what happens. Okay, so our timer has gone off at the end of 10 minutes. And we're just going to take a quick peek at the oven now and make sure everything's okay. And other than it is really steamy and hard on the eyes, yeah, we can see that things are coming along well. It's still very, the filling is still very liquid, but we'll close that up and we'll change our oven back to 350 degrees, which means it is going to take a little bit to cool down to that stage, but that's where we'll bake it from now on. And I'm going to put it on for, we need to cook it for another 45 to 50 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the timer on for about 35 minutes, which is 10 minutes less than the minimum amount. And at that point, I will take that barrier off from the edges to let the edge firm up just a bit. All right, so our timer has just gone off for our second cooking phase, which was after 35 minutes. And this is at 350 degrees. So we're going to open it up here now. And oh, you can see how, hopefully, on this camera angle, that the filling is starting to thicken just a little bit. And at this point, I'm going to take these edges off, and these are incredibly hot, so I'm not even going to come close to touching them. And just going to give it a moment with the fork here. There we go. So we've got little bubbles around the edges, and the edge of the crust is a little bit brown, but it's not burnt. And our edge of the pie, you can see it's starting to cook around the outside. It is going to take that extra 10 minutes at least, I would say. So we'll pop that back in. Check it at the end of 10 again. And at that point, we'll just poke it with a knife just to be sure that it is cooked all the way. Okay, so there's our timer going for the official cooking time. And this is where we see if we're spot on here or not. Open these up, and don't those look gorgeous? So what we're going to do is just a plain ordinary kitchen knife, and we want to see if these are done yet. And we're just going to insert that into the center. And if it comes out clean, that means that it's cooked. And there is a little bit of residue on there, And also on this one, so this is the pumpkin here and this is the carrot here. You can see on the carrot one that there's still some moisture kind of bubbling around the edge. So I am going to just double check on that one too. Yeah, that one's not nearly as done. So we've still got a little bit of moisture, or a little bit of residue on there. I'm going to give these another 5 minutes. And, you know, there's all kinds of factors that can affect your cooking times. Some of it is the fact that I've had the oven door open and closed several times because of filming. Sometimes it's atmospheric pressure, depending on where you live. If you live in higher elevations, it can take longer to cook things. Sometimes it's the type of pan that you're using. So you always err on the side of caution, put it in for the shorter time frame, and then you can always cook it more, but you can't cook it less. So we're going to put it on for another, I'm going to give it another 5 minutes, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so let's see what that extra 5 minutes has done for us. So again, we go into the center with a clean knife. Kind of getting about the same, but it's starting to crack around the edge. And I'm going to go over here. Yeah, I think we're good to go here. So what I'm going to do on this next part, again, we have to remember that all of this is incredibly hot, and we've got nice flaky pastry that we're dealing with, and the center is very soft. As it cools, it will get more solid, but right now it's pretty soft. So what I do is I just take a regular cookie sheet, but one that doesn't have an edge on it, and I just slide the tray on, or slide the pie onto my cookie sheet and lift it that way. So that way I'm not as likely to burn my fingers or drop the pie, which has been known to happen. And then we'll do the same with this one. More of a sliding rather than lifting. And even with that, I kind of nicked the top of that pie with my oven mitt, but nonetheless, there we go. And what you can see here is on the edges of the pie crust, you can tell already how flaky it is just by flicking it with my finger. The flakes are coming off. We are going to let these cool down. Of course, I'm not, being a glass dish, I'm not going to put it straight into the refrigerator. I'm going to let them cool down, and then we'll slice into them and whip up that whipped cream and have a wonderful dessert. All right, so we have an extra little bonus round here, and that is that I took the remaining pie crust, that little scrap, and popped it in the oven here. That was about maybe 5 minutes, and all I did was I sprinkled some cinnamon and sugar on it, and when you do that, you end up with a little kind of a cookie thing. You could cut it into pieces, but for me it wasn't that big a piece. And well, I think maybe I'm going to give it another couple of minutes. That's not quite done. Okay, folks, so we have a little bonus here, and this was the remainder of the scraps of pastry that was left over, and I've just sprinkled it with cinnamon and sugar, And I could have cut it into little pieces, but I didn't. I left it all in one slice. But you can see how when we cut it apart, how the flakes are in there. And that's what and this is considering that this is the pastry that's been worked twice. So that's what you want your pastry to look like. So it's got little flakes of stuff in it. And then once this cools down enough to handle, it'll be just perfect with a cup of tea while we're waiting for the other, for the rest of the pies to cool enough so that we can put the whipped cream on top and get them all sliced up. So there's your little bonus. All right, so our pies have now cooled, and we have the two pies. We have this one here is the pumpkin pie, and this one here is the carrot pie. And the only way that I know is because they were slightly different pans, and I remember nicking the top of the carrot pie when I took it out of the oven. The two marks here, that's where I stuck the knife in to see if it was cooked or not. Those, of course, we're going to cover up with whipped cream, so that doesn't matter. And we've got some beautiful flaky crust that's part of this. But speaking of whipped cream, that's the next thing, is we have to get ready and make the whipped cream. So you'd think that this is pretty basic. We should be able to do this with no problem at all. And we are going to, but I want you to see that there's a little bit more to it than just beating it up. We've got our hand mixer. If you have one power tool in your kitchen, this hand mixer is probably the first one you want to start with. This little puppy is probably 40 years old and it's been through a lot, but it's perfect for this kind of thing, this and egg whites and stuff like that. Now this is going to get a little noisy, but I want you to see how I'm holding the bowl and the mixers, because the object of this is to get as much air into it as possible. So you don't want to just stand here like this and turn it around and around and around. You want to allow the air to fluff in through it. And right away you can see the bubbles starting to come up. You have to keep it under control so you don't end up with cream all over your kitchen. But you want to keep moving that around and letting the air flip up through that. Also, by keeping the bowl kind of tipped, that gives me more surface area as well. And we're about double the volume that we started off with. Now, it's a lot thicker than it was, and it is more than double in size. So now we're going to get ready for the next part of this. So one of the things about making whipped cream is if you make it too far ahead of time, it might start to separate or to reduce in volume. So we want to do something that's going to stop that from happening. And what we're going to do here is we're going to add a little bit of unflavored gelatin. And this is the same stuff that would be in your typical Jell-O, except there's no flavors to it, right there, unflavored. So by taking this, and we want a little bit of quite hot water, not a lot, but a little bit. And we're going to mix this in just to moisten it. No more than enough to moisten it, because if you put in too much water, then that's going to make things kind of runny again. So I'm just going to put in a couple of tablespoons of hot water. Just enough that gelatin is moistened. Maybe a little more than that. There we go. And come on. Yeah. Okay, then we're going to get this going again. This is where you need about 3 hands some days, but as soon as a glop goes in there, you right away want to mix it up. Because once this starts to cool, and the whipped cream itself is cool, then it's immediately going to start to thicken or to solidify. And then the second thing we want to add is just a little bit of sugar. Some people will also add a little bit of vanilla, but I'm just going to stick with a little bit of sugar, and it doesn't take very much, not even a quarter of a cup. And that's just a few, 2-3 tablespoons maybe. There we go. Look at that. Nice peaks that easily formed. Turn that on again. Well, we all want to lick the beaters. We don't want to be licking too much. So there's our whipped cream ready to go and our pie ready to go. So now I'm just going to take a plate and okay. Great. So now we've got a lovely plate here, and we're going to cut into our pie. And if we tried to do this when it was hot, the center of this would have still been way too runny to do that. We're just going to slide in around the edges, because if there's been a little bit of filling that's come through a crack in the crust, that would stick to the edge. Here we go. So, beautiful piece of pie. And we will take a little dollop of this whipping cream. Just a little dollop and a twist with the spoon as it comes off. And there you have it. And I don't know if you can get in close enough, but the bottom of this is actually quite flaky as well as the edges here. So there we have our wonderful pumpkin pie, and I'm just going to move off to the side so we can actually do another one with the carrot pie, and we're going to do the same sort of thing. The back end of it, but there's hardly any difference between the two. And just do a little dollop of whipped cream on that one. Okay, so here we have our wonderful pumpkin pie and our carrot pie, I hope that you enjoyed watching this video today and that you learned a little bit about pastry and about custard pies, and that you will remember to like and subscribe and on the YouTube channel itself, and that's what's going to get the YouTube people recommending this on a much more regular basis. Now we look forward to seeing you again in our next episode, where I will be making blueberry grunt, which is a famous East Coast dessert that they'll often have over the holidays. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.